The crystal wine glass shattered against the marble floor of Sterling Investment Group's executive dining room, sending a spray of Chateau Margaux across Ember Sinclair's uniform. The silence that followed was deafening. 30 of Manhattan's most powerful investors watching, waiting. "Clean it up," Amir Nazir commanded in Arabic, his voice dripping with assumed superiority. "Stupid girl probably doesn't even understand." But Ember understood every syllable. More than that, she recognized the Damascene dialect, the subtle mispronunciation that marked him as a fraud. In that crystalline moment, surrounded by titans of Wall Street who saw only a clumsy waitress, she made a decision that would cost him everything. "La taken gabiyan," she replied, her classical Arabic flawless and cutting. "Ana arif man anta bil hakika." "Don't be foolish. I know exactly who you really are." The room went. The 42nd floor of Sterling Investment Group's Manhattan headquarters buzzed with the kind of energy that moved billions. Ember Sinclair adjusted her black server's vest and checked her reflection in the polished elevator doors, wondering how many viewers from different corners of the world might relate to this moment of preparing for another shift in the shadows of power. The executive dining room awaited her, a sanctuary of mahogany and marble where deals worth more than most people's annual salaries were sealed over $100 stakes. She'd been working here for 3 months now, invisible to the titans of finance who barely glanced her way as they discussed mergers and acquisitions in voices that carried the casual confidence of inherited wealth. The dining room's crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across white tablecloths, each setting arranged with military precision. Ember moved between the tables with practiced efficiency, her movements economical and precise. She'd learned to read the room's energy, the subtle shifts in posture when a deal was about to close, the way conversations lowered when sensitive information was exchanged, the particular stillness that preceded either triumph or devastation. Today felt different, charged with an undercurrent of anticipation that made her more observant than usual. The regular clientele was assembled, Victoria Sterling herself holding court at the corner table, her silver hair immaculate as she discussed quarterly projections with James Whitmore from compliance. The conversation flowed around topics that would have mystified most servers: derivatives trading, regulatory frameworks, offshore structuring. But Ember found herself following along with an ease that surprised even her. Marcus Thompson, the senior server with 15 years at Sterling, caught her eye from across the room and nodded toward the entrance. "New money coming in," he murmured as he passed with a tray of champagne flutes. "Some Middle Eastern investor Victoria's been courting for months. Big portfolio, bigger ego from what I hear." Ember arranged the silverware at table 7 with mechanical precision, her mind already cataloging the observation. New money always tried harder to prove itself, often overcompensating with displays of wealth or authority that old money found distasteful but tolerated for the sake of profits. She'd seen it countless times, the need to establish dominance through small cruelties, usually directed at those perceived as powerless. The service staff bore the brunt of these performances, invisible targets for the insecurities of the newly wealthy. The elevator chimed, and Amir Nazir stepped into the dining room like he owned it. Tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, he carried himself with the particular swagger of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His eyes swept the room with calculating precision, taking inventory of who was present, who might be watching, who might be impressed. Ember noticed the way he paused at the threshold, allowing the room to notice him before making his entrance. A classic power move that screamed desperation to anyone who understood the real dynamics at play. His accent, when he greeted Victoria Sterling, carried just enough Middle Eastern inflection to sound exotic without being threatening to American sensibilities. It was perfectly calibrated, too perfectly calibrated, like a performance that had been rehearsed until it became second nature. "Mr. Nazir, welcome," Victoria said, rising to greet him with a kind of enthusiasm that was reserved for 9-figure investment portfolios. "I trust your flight from Dubai was comfortable?" Amir's smile was practiced, all white teeth and calculated charm, as he took her outstretched hand. "Flawless, thank you. Though I must say, your reputation precedes you, Miss Sterling." I've heard remarkable things about your firm's performance in emerging markets." The conversation continued in the familiar dance of high finance courting, compliments disguised as assessments, casual mentions of wealth that served as credentials, the delicate probing that preceded any serious business relationship. Ember refilled water glasses at nearby tables, her presence so normalized that the conversation continued around her as if she were furniture. She noticed the tells immediately. The way Amir's accent slipped occasionally, becoming more American when he was focused on making a point. The moment of hesitation when Victoria mentioned specific regions in the Middle East, as if he were mentally translating cultural references. The way his eyes tracked the room's service staff with the particular hunger of someone who needed to establish his place in the hierarchy. These were subtle things, barely perceptible to those who weren't trained to read people. But Ember had spent years learning to decode the language of power and insecurity. Her academic work had taught her to recognize the patterns of performance and authenticity, the micro-expressions that revealed when someone was playing a role rather than simply being themselves. The lunch service began with the usual choreography, Marcus taking point on the VIP table while Ember handled the peripheral tables, each server moving in carefully orchestrated patterns that ensured seamless service without intrusion. Amir settled into his role as the afternoon star performer, regaling his audience with carefully curated stories of international investments and cultural insights that sounded impressive to American ears but rang hollow to anyone with actual regional knowledge. Ember found herself listening despite herself, her years of Middle Eastern studies allowing her to pick up on the inconsistencies in his narrative, references that didn't quite align with actual cultural practices, pronunciation that suggested textbook learning rather than native fluency, historical details that were just slightly off in ways that only an expert would notice. The power dynamics in the room were fascinating from an anthropological perspective. Amir was clearly performing his wealth and connections for an audience that desperately wanted to believe in his authenticity, while Victoria and her colleagues were performing their sophistication and cultural awareness for someone they hoped would bring them significant profits. Everyone was acting, playing roles they thought the others expected to see, creating an elaborate theater of mutual deception that would continue until someone's performance proved inadequate. Ember had seen this dance before, but never from such close proximity, never with such clear sight lines into the mechanics of how financial power was performed rather than simply exercised. As the afternoon wore on, Amir's confidence grew more pronounced, his gestures broader, his voice carrying further across the dining room. He began making casual demands of the service staff, not quite rude enough to offend his hosts, but assertive enough to establish his perceived status. "More ice," he'd say without looking up from his conversation. "Fresh bread." Each request delivered with the tone of someone who expected immediate compliance without gratitude. Ember watched the other servers comply with professional smiles, their years of experience having taught them to absorb these small indignities without reaction. But she also noticed the way James Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly when Amir snapped his fingers for attention, the momentary flicker of distaste that crossed Victoria's face when he interrupted her mid-sentence to demand service. Even in their desire to court his business, they recognized the performance of power as crude and unnecessary. The stage was set, all the pieces arranged for what was coming next. Ember could feel the tension building like pressure behind a dam, the inevitable moment when performance would collide with reality and someone's carefully constructed facade would crack under the weight of their own arrogance. She continued her work with quiet efficiency, invisible to the power players at the center of the room, but more aware than any of them realized of exactly what was about to unfold. The afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows had shifted to that golden tone that photographers call magic hour, casting long shadows across the dining room's Persian rugs. Amir Nazir was holding court now, his voice carrying the particular confidence of someone who believed his audience was completely convinced by his performance. He'd been drinking steadily for the past hour, not enough to impair his judgment, but sufficient to lower his inhibitions and amplify his need to demonstrate dominance. Ember watched from the service station as he gestured expansively, describing a supposed real estate deal in Beirut that sounded impressive until you realized he'd mixed up neighborhoods that were actually miles apart. The details mattered, but only if you knew enough to catch them. Victoria Sterling was leaning forward with practiced interest, her decades in finance having taught her to maintain engagement even when her internal radar was picking up inconsistencies. "The regulatory environment must be challenging," she said, probing gently for specifics that would either confirm or contradict her growing suspicions about her potential client. Amir's response was smooth but vague, the kind of non-answer that suggested broad knowledge rather than intimate experience. "You learn to navigate these waters," he said with a casual wave of his hand, "especially when you have the right connections." It was becoming clear to anyone paying close attention that his connections were more theoretical than practical. His regional expertise more performed than lived. The wine service provided the perfect opportunity for escalation. Ember approached the table with the afternoon's featured vintage, a $2,000 bottle of Chateau Margaux that Victoria had selected to impress her prospective client. The ritual of wine presentation was one of Sterling's signatures. The server would present the bottle, open it with ceremony, and pour a tasting portion for approval before serving the table. It was theater as much as service, a demonstration of refinement that helped justify the firm's premium fees. Ember had performed this routine hundreds of times, her movements so practiced they were nearly automatic. But as she approached Amir's position, she noticed the way his eyes tracked her movement with the particular attention of someone looking for an opportunity to assert authority. The crystal wine glass was baccarat, part of a set that cost more than most people's monthly salary. As Ember leaned forward to pour the tasting portion, Amir shifted in his seat with deliberate casualness, his elbow moving just enough to create the collision that sent the glass tumbling toward the marble floor. The sound of shattering crystal was like a gunshot in the refined atmosphere of the dining room, followed by the splash of red wine across Ember's white blouse and black vest. The silence that followed was absolute. 30 of Manhattan's most powerful investors frozen in a tableau of shock and embarrassment. This wasn't the kind of scene that belonged in Sterling's carefully curated environment, and everyone knew it. "How clumsy," Amir said in English, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure everyone heard his assessment. Then, switching to Arabic with the casual cruelty of someone who believed himself safe from understanding, he continued his performance. "هذه الفتاة غبية لا تعرف أي شيء." The girl is stupid and doesn't know anything. His pronunciation was textbook perfect, the kind of classical Arabic learned from expensive tutors rather than lived experience. But his choice of words revealed both his arrogance and his fundamental misunderstanding of where he was and who might be listening. "Mayhim la tafam lugatana." Doesn't matter, she doesn't understand our language. Ember felt the familiar weight of assumption settle around her like a shroud. In that moment, she was supposed to be invisible, powerless, reduced to the role of clumsy service staff who existed only to clean up messes and accept blame for the casual cruelties of their betters. The script was written, the expectations clear. She would apologize, clean up the wine, disappear back into invisibility, while the important people continued their important conversation. Everyone in the room knew their role in this particular theater, from the sympathetic but distant expressions on the investors' faces to Victoria's careful calculation of whether defending her staff might offend a potential 9-figure client. The moment stretched like a held breath, pregnant with the possibility of different choices. But Ember had spent too many years studying the dynamics of power and language to play the role they expected. Her doctoral work in Middle Eastern studies hadn't just taught her Arabic. It had taught her to recognize the subtle markers of authenticity and performance, the tiny tells that revealed when someone was playing a character rather than speaking from genuine experience. Amir's Arabic was flawless but sterile, learned from books and pronunciation guides rather than absorbed through the messy complexity of actual life in the region. More importantly, his casual assumption that no one could challenge him in his linguistic safe space revealed both his arrogance and his fundamental miscalculation about the world he was trying to navigate. "La takun gabian," she replied, her voice cutting through the silence with classical Arabic that was not only flawless, but carried the particular rhythm of someone who had learned it alongside native speakers rather than in academic isolation. Ana arif man anta bil hakika. Don't be foolish. I know exactly who you really are. The words hung in the air like smoke, visible and toxic, transforming the entire dynamic of the room in the space of a heartbeat. Every eye was fixed on her now, the invisible server suddenly commanding more attention than any of the billionaires at their carefully arranged tables. Amir's face underwent a transformation that would have been comical if it weren't so revealing. The color drained from his olive complexion, his carefully maintained composure cracking like ice under sudden pressure. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, the smooth confidence that had carried him through the afternoon's performance evaporating in real time. For the first time since entering the dining room, he looked genuinely vulnerable, caught between languages and identities with no script to guide him through what came next. The silence stretched impossibly long, 30 seconds that felt like hours as everyone processed the implications of what they had just witnessed. Victoria Sterling's expression was unreadable, her decades of experience in high-stakes negotiations having taught her to maintain neutrality while rapidly recalculating odds and opportunities. James Whitmore leaned back in his chair with what might have been the beginning of a smile, his compliance officer instincts recognizing the moment when someone's careful facade began to develop cracks that might reveal interesting information beneath. The other investors exchanged glances that mixed confusion with curiosity. This wasn't the kind of dinner entertainment they were accustomed to, but it was certainly more engaging than the usual discussions of market volatility and regulatory frameworks. Ember set down the wine bottle with deliberate calm, her movements controlled and precise as she surveyed the scene she had just transformed. The broken crystal lay scattered across the marble like fallen stars, each shard reflecting the light in patterns that seemed almost intentional. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, the sudden shift in power dynamics that had elevated her from invisible service worker to the center of attention in a space where attention was the ultimate currency. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the service station, leaving Amir to navigate the wreckage of his carefully constructed performance without the safety net of assumed linguistic superiority. The dining room remained frozen in tableau for several more seconds before conversation began to resume in hushed tones. But the damage was done, the performance irreparably altered, and everyone knew that what had just transpired would be remembered long after the details of international investment strategies were forgotten. Amir reached for his water glass with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, the first visible crack in the confident facade he had maintained since arriving. The game had changed, and he was no longer certain he understood the rules. The service corridors behind Sterling Investment Group's executive dining room buzzed with a different kind of energy than the polished performance spaces where clients gathered. Here, among the industrial dishwashers and walk-in refrigerators, the real work happened. The logistics that made seamless service possible, the careful choreography that kept the illusion of effortless elegance intact. Ember found herself at the center of unprecedented attention as word of the Arabic exchange spread through the staff with the speed of wildfire. Marcus Thompson cornered her near the coffee station, his 15 years of experience having taught him to recognize when something significant had shifted in the carefully balanced ecosystem of high-end service. "Girl, what just happened out there?" Marcus's voice carried a mixture of admiration and concern that reflected the complexity of their situation. "I've never seen anything like that in my entire career. That man looked like he'd seen a ghost when you started speaking his language." Ember dried her hands slowly, considering how much to reveal about her background and motivations. The service staff at Sterling existed in a strange liminal space, invisible to the clients but privy to their most sensitive conversations, trusted with information that could move markets but expected to remain silent about everything they witnessed. Breaking that code of professional invisibility, even in the service of justice, carried risks that extended far beyond her temporary employment. The immediate aftermath had been surreal. Amir had excused himself from the table within minutes of her response, claiming an urgent overseas call that required privacy. Victoria Sterling had continued the lunch with professional grace, but Ember could see the calculations happening behind her carefully maintained composure, the mental notes being filed, the questions being formulated for later investigation. James Whitmore had been more direct, catching Ember's eye as she cleared adjacent tables and nodding toward his office with the universal signal for a private conversation that would happen before the day ended. The other investors had returned to their discussions with the forced normalcy of people who weren't quite sure what they had witnessed but knew it was significant. Riley Chen, the restaurant manager, appeared at Ember's elbow with the kind of urgent energy that preceded either termination or promotion. "Ms. Sterling wants to see you in conference room 3 in 20 minutes, she said, her voice carefully neutral. "She also asked me to find out everything I can about your background, specifically your language skills and educational history." The request was simultaneously routine and extraordinary. Background checks were standard for Sterling employees, but detailed linguistic assessments were typically reserved for client-facing positions that required cultural sensitivity. Ember had been deliberately vague about her academic credentials during the hiring process, allowing her obvious intelligence to be dismissed as irrelevant to the requirements of food service. The 20-minute interval gave her time to consider strategy. Her original plan had been to maintain her cover for several more weeks, gathering evidence about irregular financial flows that her academic advisor had flagged in preliminary research. Professor Elena Rodriguez's former career at the Securities and Exchange Commission had taught her to recognize the patterns that suggested money laundering or sanctions violations, and Sterling's client list included several individuals whose wealth sources deserved closer scrutiny. Amir Nazir had been on that list since his first approach to the firm 6 months ago, a supposedly Damascene investor whose background seemed curiously thin when subjected to the kind of deep research that academia demanded, but financial firms often skipped when presented with sufficient capital. Conference Room 3 overlooked Central Park, its floor-to-ceiling windows providing the kind of view that subtly reminded visitors of Sterling's position in Manhattan's hierarchy of power. Victoria Sterling was waiting with James Whitmore and a third person Ember didn't recognize, a woman in her 40s with the particular alertness of someone whose job involved asking uncomfortable questions. "Ms. Sinclair," Victoria said, gesturing toward a chair that faced the windows but kept her visible to all three questioners. "I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell from our external security consultancy. She specializes in background verification and client due diligence." The questions began gently, but with increasing specificity. Educational background: Columbia University. Doctoral candidate in international business with a focus on Middle Eastern financial systems. Language skills: Arabic, French, German, and basic Farsi, acquired through academic study and a junior year abroad that had included intensive cultural immersion programs. Research focus: irregular capital flows and sanctions evasion techniques, particularly as they related to individuals claiming regional expertise they didn't actually possess. Each answer shifted the dynamic in the room, transforming Ember from service worker to potential asset in ways that made everyone recalculate their assumptions about who she was and what she might know. "Your Arabic response to Mr. Nazir," Sarah Mitchell said, her voice carrying the particular precision of someone accustomed to extracting truth from carefully constructed lies. "Can you tell us exactly what he said and how you knew to respond as you did?" Ember had anticipated this question and prepared an answer that would reveal enough to be useful without compromising her larger investigation. "His pronunciation was textbook perfect but culturally inauthentic," she explained. "Native speakers develop regional variations and colloquial shortcuts that are nearly impossible to replicate through formal study alone. His insults suggested someone who had learned Arabic as a foreign language rather than growing up with it." James Whitmore leaned forward with the intensity of someone whose compliance responsibilities had just become significantly more complex. "Are you suggesting that Mr. Nazir misrepresented his cultural background?" The question hung in the air with implications that extended far beyond simple cultural performance. Financial regulations required detailed disclosure of client backgrounds, particularly when dealing with international transfers and investment vehicles that could potentially violate sanctions regimes. If Amir had systematically misrepresented his identity, every transaction he had proposed would require immediate reevaluation. I'm suggesting that his linguistic performance indicates formal study rather than cultural immersion, Ember replied carefully. Whether that constitutes misrepresentation would depend on how he's represented himself in your business relationship. Victoria Sterling's expression had shifted from polite interest to sharp focus, her decades of experience having taught her to recognize when seemingly small discrepancies might indicate larger problems. The financial services industry operated on trust and verification. But the verification process often stopped at surface-level credentials when clients presented sufficient capital and appropriate documentation. Sarah Mitchell made notes with the systematic precision of someone building a case file. "We'll need to review our entire relationship with Mr. Nazir," she said, addressing Victoria rather than Ember. "If there are questions about his background, we should resolve them before any significant financial commitments are made." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes. Covering topics that ranged from Ember's research methodologies to Sterling's internal procedures for client verification. By the time it concluded, everyone in the room understood that the afternoon's wine incident had revealed cracks in a facade that demanded immediate investigation. Walking back toward the service areas, Ember felt the weight of acceleration. Her careful, methodical research plan had been compressed into real-time crisis management, forcing her to reveal capabilities she had hoped to keep hidden for several more weeks. But the opportunity to access Sterling's internal investigation resources was worth the risk of exposure, particularly if it meant uncovering the full scope of whatever scheme Amir was operating. The broken crystal had been more than symbolic. It had shattered the careful boundaries between her academic research and the real-world consequences of financial fraud. Marcus Thompson was waiting by the staff elevators with the kind of expression that meant news had traveled through the building's informal communication networks. "Word is they're doing a full background check on your friend from lunch," he said quietly. "Security's been asking questions about his previous visits, who he met with, what kind of conversations he had." The speed of institutional response was impressive and slightly terrifying. Sterling hadn't built its reputation by allowing potential problems to fester unaddressed. "Whatever you started up there, it's moving fast now." The Columbia University Library's Middle Eastern Studies section had become Ember's war room. Spread across the mahogany table were financial records, linguistic analysis notes, and immigration documents that painted a picture far more complex than anyone at Sterling Investment Group had suspected. Her academic advisor, Professor Elena Rodriguez, sat across from her with the expression of someone whose worst suspicions were being systematically confirmed. "The patterns you've identified are textbook sanctions." "Evasion," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 15 years at the Securities and Exchange Commission before transitioning to academia. "If this Amir Nazir is who I think he is, Sterling is about to have a much bigger problem than cultural misrepresentation." The real Kyle Brennan had been surprisingly easy to find once they knew what to look for. Born in Cleveland, Ohio, educated at Ohio State University with a degree in international business that he'd parlayed into a series of increasingly questionable ventures in currency trading and offshore investment vehicles. His transformation into Amir Nazir had been gradual and sophisticated, beginning with a legitimate consulting firm that specialized in Middle Eastern markets and evolving into a full identity reconstruction that included fabricated cultural credentials and a carefully curated social media presence that suggested lifelong regional connections. The attention to detail was impressive from a technical standpoint, but it relied on the assumption that no one with actual expertise would scrutinize his performance closely enough to identify the inconsistencies. Ember's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Thompson. "Your friend is back, asking questions about you. Wants to know your schedule, where you go after work, whether you live alone. Management told him to back off, but he's persistent." The escalation was happening faster than anticipated, Kyle's panic driving him to make increasingly desperate choices that would ultimately serve as evidence of his deception. Smart criminals understood that the best response to potential exposure was strategic withdrawal. Desperate criminals made mistakes that provided law enforcement with roadmaps to their entire operation. The evidence they'd assembled was damning but required careful presentation to be maximally effective. Kyle's financial transactions showed a pattern of moving money through jurisdictions with weak banking oversight, using investment vehicles that existed primarily on paper to obscure the actual sources and destinations of significant capital flows. His linguistic performance had been the weak link, too perfect to be natural, too studied to be authentic, revealing the gap between academic knowledge and lived experience that only someone with genuine expertise would recognize. The combination of financial irregularities and identity fraud created a case that would interest both federal prosecutors and international regulators. "We need to be strategic about timing," Elena said, reviewing the timeline they'd constructed of Kyle's activities over the past 18 months. "If Sterling files a suspicious activity report too early, he'll disappear before federal investigators can freeze his assets. If they wait too long, he might complete whatever transactions he's planning and move the money beyond recovery." The balance between academic research and real-world enforcement was delicate. Universities could investigate without triggering the legal obligations that financial institutions faced when they discovered evidence of criminal activity. Ember's laptop chimed with an email from James Whitmore at Sterling. The compliance department had completed their preliminary review of Kyle's documentation and found several discrepancies that required immediate clarification. His passport showed travel patterns that didn't match his claimed business activities. His references included individuals who either didn't exist or had no record of professional relationships with him. And his investment portfolio contained assets that appeared to be shell companies with minimal actual operations. "They're moving faster than I expected," Ember told Elena. "Whitmore wants to schedule a follow-up interview tomorrow to discuss my observations about cultural authenticity markers." The academic implications were as significant as the legal ones. Ember's research into financial fraud patterns was evolving from theoretical study to practical application in ways that would likely influence her dissertation and, possibly, her entire career trajectory. The intersection of linguistic analysis and financial investigation represented a relatively unexplored area of interdisciplinary research, particularly as global financial systems became increasingly sophisticated in their methods of obscuring illegal activities. This case could establish new protocols for cultural verification in international finance, Elena observed. "If you can prove that linguistic analysis can identify fraudulent identity claims, it becomes a tool for compliance departments worldwide." Sterling Investment Group's internal investigation was accelerating with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested they understood the potential scope of their exposure. Victoria Sterling herself had called an emergency meeting of the firm's senior partners to discuss their client verification procedures and the possibility that other international investors might be operating under similarly questionable credentials. The reputational risks were enormous. Financial services firms lived and died on trust, and any suggestion that they had been systematically deceived by criminal enterprises would have consequences that extended far beyond immediate legal liability. Kyle's desperation was becoming increasingly visible to anyone paying attention. His attempts to gather information about Ember had evolved from casual inquiries to more aggressive investigation techniques that included hiring a private security firm to conduct surveillance on her apartment building. The escalation was counterproductive from a strategic standpoint, but revealed the psychology of someone whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling faster than he could repair it. "He's making classic mistakes," Elena observed, reviewing the security reports that Sterling's investigators had shared. "Panic responses instead of strategic withdrawal." The Columbia campus provided an ideal environment for the next phase of their investigation. Academic institutions had resources for international research that often exceeded what was available to private corporations, particularly when it came to verifying credentials and cultural claims that required specialized expertise. Ember's department colleagues were contributing linguistic analysis, cultural authentication, and even psychological profiling based on the behavioral patterns they'd observed during Kyle's performance at Sterling. The collaborative nature of academic research was proving ideally suited to deconstructing the kind of complex fraud that relied on no single individual having access to all the information necessary to identify the deception. "Tomorrow's meeting at Sterling will be crucial," Elena said as they packed up their research materials. They need enough evidence to justify involving federal authorities, but not so much that they feel obligated to act before investigators are prepared to move comprehensively. The timing required precise calibration. Financial institutions that failed to report suspicious activities faced severe penalties, but premature reporting could compromise law enforcement investigations by alerting criminals to the scope of official knowledge about their operations. Ember walked through the campus toward her apartment with the strange sensation of living in multiple realities simultaneously. To her neighbors and classmates, she was a graduate student working part-time to support her studies. To Sterling Investment Group, she was becoming a valuable consultant whose expertise might help them avoid criminal liability. To Kyle Brennan, she was a threat whose knowledge could destroy the elaborate identity he had constructed over several years of careful planning. The convergence of these different versions of herself was approaching a point where maintaining multiple roles would become impossible. The broken crystal from Sterling's dining room had become a symbol of something larger than cultural misunderstanding or service accidents. It represented the fragility of constructed identities when subjected to scrutiny by people with the knowledge and motivation to look beyond surface presentations. Kyle had built his entire scheme on the assumption that no one would possess both the linguistic expertise to identify his deception and the financial knowledge to understand its implications. That assumption was about to cost him everything he had worked to steal. The Sterling Investment Group building hummed with a different energy than Ember had ever experienced during her months of service work. News of Kyle Brennan's true identity had spread through the executive floors with the speed and intensity of a financial contagion, triggering emergency protocols that transformed the normally sedate atmosphere into something resembling a war room. Victoria Sterling's corner office had become mission control for an investigation that now involved not only internal compliance, but external security consultants, federal regulators, and international banking authorities. The scope of Kyle's deception was proving far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected, with tentacles reaching into offshore accounts and shell companies across 3 continents. James Whitmore greeted Ember at the executive elevator with the kind of focused intensity that she'd only seen during final examinations or dissertation defenses. "We've discovered that Mr. Brennan, I refuse to call him Nazir anymore, has been operating this identity for at least 4 years, he said as they walked toward the conference room where Sterling's crisis management team had assembled. His financial footprint suggests he's moved over $200 million through various investment vehicles, most of which appear to be fraudulent constructions designed to obscure money laundering operations. The numbers were staggering and explained the level of institutional panic that had gripped Sterling since her Arabic revelation had started unraveling Kyle's carefully constructed facade. The conference room contained more firepower than most corporate investigations warranted. Sarah Mitchell from External Security was coordinating with Agent David Park from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, while Professor Elena Rodriguez participated via secure video conference from Columbia's Law Library. Victoria Sterling presided over the assembled expertise with the calm authority of someone who had built her career by making difficult decisions under pressure. "Ms. Sinclair," she said, as Ember took her designated seat, "your linguistic analysis has opened a door we didn't even know existed. We need to understand exactly how deep Mr. Brennan's deception goes, and whether there are other individuals operating similar schemes within our client base." Kyle's counterattack had begun that morning with a coordinated assault on Ember's credibility and Sterling's investigation procedures. His legal team, expensive attorneys whose presence suggested resources far exceeding those of a typical graduate student, had filed complaints with Columbia University alleging academic misconduct and harassment. Simultaneously, private investigators had begun approaching her classmates and neighbors with questions designed to uncover embarrassing information that could be used to discredit her observations about his linguistic performance. The strategy was transparent but potentially effective. Academic institutions were notoriously sensitive to anything that might compromise their reputation for scholarly integrity. "The legal pressure is standard intimidation tactics," Agent Park explained, his 20 years with federal law enforcement having taught him to recognize the patterns of white-collar criminal defense strategies. When sophisticated fraud operations feel threatened, they typically attack the credibility of witnesses and investigators rather than disputing the underlying evidence. The fact that Mr. Brennan is investing significant resources in discrediting Ms. Sinclair suggests he understands that her linguistic analysis is the thread that will unravel his entire operation. The FBI's involvement elevated the investigation from corporate compliance matter to federal criminal case, bringing resources and authorities that private firms couldn't access independently. Ember found herself at the center of a storm that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her academic research had become evidence in a federal investigation. Her linguistic expertise transformed into testimony that would likely be scrutinized by defense attorneys whose job was to create reasonable doubt about her conclusions. The pressure will intensify, Professor Elena warned from the video screen. Academic fraud cases often become character assassination campaigns designed to make witnesses reluctant to testify. You need to be prepared for your entire educational and personal history to be examined by people whose goal is to find anything that can be used to undermine your credibility. Sterling's internal investigation had revealed the sophisticated nature of Kyle's long-term planning. His approach to the firm had been preceded by months of research into their client verification procedures, their cultural sensitivity training protocols, and their specific expertise gaps in Middle Eastern financial systems. He had specifically targeted Sterling because their impressive growth in international markets had outpaced their development of specialized verification capabilities, creating exactly the kind of institutional blind spot that sophisticated fraudsters learn to exploit. He did his homework, Sarah Mitchell observed grimly. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was systematic exploitation of institutional vulnerability. The evidence was mounting rapidly as Sterling's resources were applied to deconstructing Kyle's fabricated identity. His claimed educational credentials from universities in Damascus and Beirut were completely fictitious, created through sophisticated document forgery that included fake transcripts, fabricated recommendation letters, and counterfeit professional certifications. His business references in the Middle East were either non-existent individuals or real people who had no knowledge of any professional relationship with him. Most damaging, his investment portfolio contained companies that existed only on paper, their impressive financial statements created through accounting fraud that would likely result in additional federal charges beyond identity theft and money laundering. We're coordinating with international banking authorities to trace the flow of funds through Mr. Brennan's various corporate entities, Agent Park explained to the assembled team. Initial analysis suggests that at least 60% of his claimed assets are either stolen funds or money that originated from sanctioned individuals and organizations. If that proves accurate, we're looking at violations of multiple federal statutes and international banking regulations. The scope of criminal liability was expanding beyond what anyone had anticipated when Ember first responded to Kyle's Arabic insults 3 days earlier. Kyle's desperation was becoming increasingly visible and increasingly dangerous. His attempts to intimidate Ember had escalated from legal pressure to more direct harassment, including surveillance of her apartment building and approaches to her academic colleagues that bordered on threatening. We're providing security recommendations for Ms. Sinclair, Agent Park said, but she needs to understand that federal witnesses in financial crimes cases often become targets for intimidation that extends beyond legal maneuvering. The transition from academic researcher to federal witness carried risks that Ember hadn't fully anticipated when she decided to expose Kyle's linguistic deception. Victoria Sterling's pragmatic approach to crisis management was impressive to observe. Rather than focusing on Sterling's potential liability for not detecting Kyle's fraud earlier, she was positioning the firm as a victim of sophisticated criminal enterprise, while simultaneously implementing new verification procedures that would prevent similar deceptions in the future. This case will become a model for how financial institutions should respond to identity fraud, she explained to the assembled team. We're not just investigating Mr. Brennan. We're establishing new industry standards for cultural and linguistic verification in international finance. The academic implications were as significant as the legal ones. Ember's dissertation research had evolved from theoretical analysis to practical application in ways that would likely influence how universities approached interdisciplinary studies involving language, culture, and financial systems. Professor Elena was already discussing the possibility of establishing new research protocols that combined linguistic analysis with financial investigation techniques, creating academic frameworks that could support law enforcement and compliance efforts in an increasingly globalized criminal environment. As the meeting concluded, Ember realized that her life had been permanently altered by her decision to respond to Kyle's Arabic insults with linguistic precision rather than silent acceptance. The broken crystal had indeed been symbolic, but not in ways she had anticipated. It had shattered the boundaries between academic research and real-world application, between theoretical knowledge and practical consequences, between invisible service work and visible expertise that commanded institutional attention and federal protection. The elevator ride down from Sterling's executive floors felt like descending from a different world, one where her knowledge mattered and her voice carried weight in decisions that affected millions of dollars and multiple criminal investigations. Tomorrow she would return to Columbia's library to continue her research. But now that research carried federal case numbers and would be scrutinized by defense attorneys whose job was to find flaws in her methodology and conclusions. The stakes had escalated beyond anything she had imagined when she first enrolled in graduate school. But so had the opportunities to make her academic work matter in ways that extended far beyond scholarly publication. The news broke on a Tuesday morning with the kind of media velocity that only accompanies stories combining financial scandal, international intrigue, and social media viral potential. Fake Middle Eastern investor exposed by Waitress's perfect Arabic dominated financial news feeds within hours, transforming Kyle Brennan's elaborate deception into a cautionary tale about cultural appropriation and due diligence failure that resonated far beyond the specialized world of investment banking. Ember watched the story unfold from Columbia's library, her phone buzzing incessantly with interview requests from journalists who had somehow obtained her contact information despite Sterling Investment Group's attempts to maintain her anonymity during the federal investigation. The speed of Kyle's institutional collapse was breathtaking to observe from the inside. Federal agents had executed search warrants on his Manhattan penthouse and Hamptons estate simultaneously at 6 in the morning, discovering evidence that expanded the investigation far beyond Sterling's client base. Documents seized from his personal computers revealed correspondence with individuals on international sanctions lists, detailed plans for moving money through cryptocurrency exchanges to avoid banking oversight, and most damaging, explicit acknowledgement that his Arabic language training had been acquired specifically to facilitate investment fraud targeting American firms with limited Middle Eastern expertise. The premeditation was so comprehensive that federal prosecutors were confident they could demonstrate criminal intent dating back at least 5 years. Victoria Sterling's crisis management strategy proved masterful in execution. Rather than attempting to minimize Sterling's involvement or deflect responsibility for their inadequate verification procedures, she positioned the firm as a victim of sophisticated criminal enterprise, while simultaneously announcing comprehensive reforms to their client screening protocols. This incident has taught us that cultural and linguistic verification requires the same rigor we apply to financial due diligence, she told the Financial Times in an interview that would be quoted extensively in business schools for years to come. We're implementing new standards that will help prevent similar deceptions across the entire financial services industry. Kyle's legal team's attempts to discredit Ember backfired spectacularly as media attention focused on her academic credentials and research methodology. Instead of appearing as an overeager graduate student making unfounded accusations, she emerged as a serious scholar whose expertise had uncovered criminal activity that might have continued for years without detection. Professor Elena Rodriguez's interviews with academic journals emphasized the sophisticated nature of linguistic analysis required to identify Kyle's deception, elevating Ember's work from anecdotal observation to rigorous intellectual investigation. Ms. Sinclair's analysis demonstrates how interdisciplinary research can provide practical tools for detecting sophisticated fraud, Elena explained to the Chronicle of Higher Education. This case will likely influence how universities approach the intersection of cultural studies and financial crimes investigation. The social media dimension of the story created complications that traditional financial scandals typically avoided. Video clips of Ember's Arabic response to Kyle's insults, reconstructed by witnesses and verified by Sterling's security footage, went viral across multiple platforms with the kind of organic reach that public relations firms spend millions trying to achieve artificially. The narrative of an underestimated service worker exposing a wealthy fraud through linguistic expertise resonated with audiences far beyond finance industry professionals, creating popular pressure for aggressive prosecution that federal authorities found both helpful and constraining. Public attention can be useful for ensuring adequate resources are devoted to investigation, Agent Park explained during one of their coordination meetings. But it can also create expectations for rapid resolution that don't align with the methodical approach federal prosecutions require. Kyle's final desperate gambit involved attempting to flee the country using yet another false identity, this one claiming Irish citizenship through fabricated genealogical documentation. His arrest at JFK Airport made front-page news in the New York Times, complete with photographs that showed the dramatic contrast between his carefully curated Amir Nazir persona and the disheveled Kyle Brennan, who was led away in federal custody. The multiple passports found in his possession revealed the scope of his identity fraud operations, suggesting involvement in international criminal networks that extended far beyond the relatively simple investment scheme that had first brought him to Sterling's attention. The financial damage assessment painted a picture of criminal enterprise that shocked even experienced federal investigators. Kyle's various fraudulent investment vehicles had stolen or laundered approximately $400 million over 5 years, affecting victims that included pension funds, university endowments, and individual investors who had trusted Sterling's reputation for careful due diligence. The revelation that such massive fraud had been perpetrated by someone whose cultural credentials could have been exposed through basic linguistic analysis created industry-wide soul-searching about verification procedures that had remained essentially unchanged since the pre-internet era. Ember's transformation from invisible service worker to federal witness and media figure required significant psychological adjustment. The Columbia University administration had assigned her additional security while providing media training to help her navigate interview requests responsibly. "Your academic career has been permanently altered by these events," Professor Elena observed during one of their frequent strategy sessions. "The question now is how to leverage this experience into research and teaching opportunities that can make lasting contributions to both linguistic analysis and financial crimes prevention." The legal proceedings moved with unusual speed as Kyle's defense attorneys struggled to construct plausible explanations for evidence that included his own written acknowledgments of criminal intent. Federal prosecutors had assembled a case so comprehensive that plea negotiations began almost immediately, focusing more on sentence reduction than disputing guilt. When criminals document their own planning as thoroughly as Mr. Brennan did, defense options become extremely limited, Agent Park explained. His attorneys are essentially arguing for mercy rather than innocence at this point. Sterling Investment Group's institutional response established new industry standards that would influence financial services regulation for decades. Their comprehensive review of international client verification procedures revealed systematic vulnerabilities that had been exploited not only by Kyle but potentially by other fraudsters whose deceptions had simply been more successful at avoiding detection. The firm's willingness to acknowledge these failures while implementing meaningful reforms earned praise from regulators and restored much of the institutional credibility that might otherwise have been permanently damaged by their association with Kyle's crimes. The academic implications of the case were profound and far-reaching. Multiple universities began developing interdisciplinary programs that combined linguistic analysis with financial investigation techniques, creating new career paths for students whose interests spanned cultural studies and law enforcement. Ember's methodology for identifying cultural appropriation in professional settings became required reading in business schools, while her linguistic analysis techniques were adopted by federal agencies responsible for investigating international financial crimes. This case demonstrates how academic expertise can provide practical tools for addressing sophisticated criminal activity, Elena told the academic conference that had been organized to discuss the broader implications of Kyle's exposure. The symbolic power of the broken crystal wine glass had evolved into something approaching cultural mythology. Business journalists used it as a metaphor for the fragility of elaborate deceptions when subjected to knowledgeable scrutiny. while social media commentary focused on themes of hidden expertise and the dangers of underestimating people based on their apparent social status. The image of expensive wine spreading across marble floors became shorthand for the moment when carefully constructed frauds collide with inconvenient truths. As federal prosecutors prepared for Kyle's sentencing hearing, the broader implications of his exposure continued to reverberate through international finance. Banking authorities in multiple countries had initiated reviews of their own client verification procedures, while academic institutions accelerated development of research programs that could provide expertise for detecting similar deceptions in the future. The broken crystal had indeed shattered more than Kyle's immediate plans. It had fractured assumptions about cultural expertise and institutional vulnerability that had enabled sophisticated fraud for far longer than anyone wanted to acknowledge. Federal District Court for the Southern District of New York buzzed with the particular energy that accompanied high-profile white-collar criminal sentencing. Kyle Brennan sat at the defendant's table in orange prison clothing that was a stark contrast to the expensive suits he had worn during his years as Amir Nazir, his lawyers flanking him with the resigned expressions of attorneys who knew their client faced decades in federal prison regardless of their advocacy efforts. Ember occupied a seat in the gallery reserved for victims and witnesses, her presence representing not only her own experience, but the hundreds of individuals and institutions that had been damaged by Kyle's elaborate fraud scheme. The transformation of the courtroom's central characters, from powerful investor and invisible service worker to federal criminal and key witness, embodied the complete reversal of fortune that had begun with her Arabic response to his linguistic cruelty. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over proceedings with the kind of methodical authority that federal financial crimes cases demanded. The evidence presented during Kyle's guilty plea hearings had revealed criminal enterprise that shocked even experienced prosecutors accustomed to sophisticated white-collar fraud. Over 5 years, his various personas and shell companies had laundered approximately $600 million from sources that included sanctioned terrorist organizations, Russian oligarchs avoiding international banking restrictions, and domestic criminals seeking to legitimize proceeds from drug trafficking and human trafficking operations. The scope of his criminal network had required coordination with international law enforcement agencies and would likely generate additional prosecutions for years to come. Mr. Brennan, Judge Morrison said as she reviewed the pre-sentencing report that documented not only his financial crimes, but the sophisticated identity theft that had enabled them. Your criminal activity represents a fundamental betrayal of trust that undermines the integrity of international financial systems. Your appropriation of Middle Eastern cultural identity to facilitate these crimes adds particularly troubling dimensions to offenses that would be serious even without the cultural deception involved. The judge's language was carefully chosen to address not only the financial damage, but the cultural implications of Kyle's systematic appropriation of identity markers that didn't belong to him. The victim impact statements painted a devastating picture of lives disrupted and institutions damaged by Kyle's elaborate deceptions. University endowments had lost tens of millions in retirement fund investments. Pension plans had been forced to reduce benefits for teachers and municipal workers, and individual investors had seen their life savings evaporate when Kyle's shell companies collapsed under federal investigation. Professor Elena Rodriguez testified about the damage to academic integrity caused by Kyle's attempts to intimidate witnesses and obstruct justice through fabricated complaints about scholarly misconduct. Mr. Brennan's crimes extended far beyond financial theft, she told the court. His systematic attacks on academic freedom and intellectual integrity represent assaults on institutional values that our society depends upon for the pursuit of truth and knowledge. Sterling Investment Group's institutional recovery had been remarkable to observe from the inside. Victoria Sterling's decision to cooperate fully with federal investigators while implementing comprehensive reforms to client verification procedures had not only minimized the firm's legal liability, but actually enhanced its reputation within the financial services industry. Their new cultural and linguistic authentication protocols had been adopted by competitors and praised by regulators as models for preventing similar deceptions in the future. This case has taught our entire industry valuable lessons about the importance of verifying cultural credentials with the same rigor we apply to financial qualifications, Victoria testified during the sentencing hearing. Sterling Investment Group is committed to ensuring that our verification procedures prevent future fraudsters from exploiting cultural assumptions for criminal purposes. Agent Park's testimony provided law enforcement perspective on Kyle's criminal methodology and its broader implications for financial crimes investigation. Mr. Brennan's systematic exploitation of cultural assumptions represents a sophisticated criminal innovation that required significant planning and coordination, he told the court. His ability to maintain false identity for multiple years while conducting massive financial fraud demonstrates the kind of criminal sophistication that federal agencies must be prepared to address through enhanced investigation techniques and international cooperation. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had already incorporated linguistic analysis training into their standard curriculum, using Kyle's case as an example of how cultural expertise could provide crucial investigative tools. Ember's own testimony focused on the academic and linguistic analysis that had first exposed Kyle's deception. But she also addressed the broader implications of his cultural appropriation for communities whose identity markers had been exploited for criminal purposes. Mr. Brennan's systematic appropriation of Middle Eastern cultural identity caused damage that extends far beyond financial losses, she told Judge Morrison. His criminal use of cultural markers that belong to legitimate communities has made it more difficult for authentic individuals from those communities to be accepted and trusted in international business settings. The harm he caused through cultural deception will likely influence how Middle Eastern professionals are perceived and treated for years to come. The defense team's mitigation arguments were limited by the comprehensiveness of evidence that Kyle himself had created through his meticulous documentation of criminal planning. Their primary strategy involved emphasizing his cooperation with federal investigators in dismantling the broader criminal network he had participated in, which had already resulted in arrests and asset seizures in multiple countries. Mr. Brennan recognizes the enormous harm his actions have caused, his lead attorney told the court. His cooperation with ongoing international investigations has provided law enforcement with unprecedented insight into sophisticated money laundering operations that might otherwise have continued for years without detection. Kyle's own statement to the court was brief and seemed calculated more for potential appeal purposes than genuine remorse. I acknowledge that my actions caused significant harm to individuals and institutions that trusted me, he said, his voice carrying none of the confident authority that had characterized his Amir Nazir persona. I accept responsibility for my crimes and hope that my cooperation with federal investigators will help prevent others from pursuing similar criminal paths. The statement's stilted language and obvious attorney coaching stood in stark contrast to the fluent Arabic he had used to insult service staff, highlighting how thoroughly his various personas had been constructed rather than authentic. Judge Morrison's sentencing decision reflected both the severity of Kyle's crimes and the broader deterrent message that federal courts needed to send about sophisticated financial fraud. Mr. Brennan, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release during which you will be prohibited from working in any capacity involving international finance or cultural consultation, she announced. Additionally, you will be required to pay full restitution to all identified victims, totaling approximately $450 million, and forfeit all assets that can be traced to your criminal enterprise. The sentence was among the longest ever imposed for nonviolent financial crimes, reflecting both the scale of damage and the sophisticated methodology that had enabled it. The courtroom's reaction was subdued but satisfied. Victim representatives expressed relief that Kyle would spend decades in prison, while law enforcement officials emphasized the precedent his case would establish for prosecuting similar crimes in the future. Ember felt a complex mixture of closure and anticipation as she realized that her academic career would forever be shaped by these events, but in ways that created opportunities to make meaningful contributions to both scholarly research and practical crime prevention. The broken crystal wine glass that had started everything now seemed like ancient history, but its symbolic power continued to resonate in contexts far beyond Sterling's executive dining room. As federal marshals led Kyle away to begin his quarter-century sentence, Ember reflected on how completely their positions had been reversed from that afternoon when he had assumed linguistic superiority over someone he perceived as powerless. The justice system's vindication felt appropriate, but the broader changes that had resulted from exposing his deception, new industry standards, academic research programs, federal investigation techniques, represented legacy impacts that would continue long after Kyle's release from prison. The real victory wasn't his punishment, but the systemic improvements that would help prevent future victims from experiencing similar deceptions. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Columbia Business School's newest conference room, where Ember Sinclair was preparing to deliver the keynote address at the International Conference on Financial Crimes and Cultural Authentication. 6 months had passed since Kyle Brennan's sentencing, and the academic world had embraced her research methodology with enthusiasm that still surprised her. The audience included federal investigators, compliance officers from major financial institutions, and scholars from universities across 3 continents, all gathered to discuss how linguistic analysis could be integrated into modern fraud prevention protocols. Her transformation from invisible service worker to respected expert had been so complete that she sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life, though the occasional flashback to crystal wine glasses reminded her that every revolution begins with a single moment of choosing courage over compliance. Professor Elena Rodriguez introduced her with the kind of academic gravitas reserved for research that bridges theoretical knowledge and practical application. Dr. Sinclair's work has fundamentally altered how we understand the intersection of cultural performance and financial fraud, Elena told the assembled experts. Her methodology for identifying linguistic authenticity markers has been adopted by federal agencies, international banking authorities, and academic institutions worldwide. The formal title still felt surreal. Ember's dissertation defense had been fast-tracked once her research became evidence in multiple federal cases, and Columbia had awarded her doctorate with unusual speed to recognize both her scholarly contributions and the practical impact of her work. Sterling Investment Group had become an unexpected case study in institutional transformation. Victoria Sterling's decision to embrace comprehensive reform rather than minimize liability had positioned the firm as an industry leader in cultural verification protocols, attracting new clients who specifically sought their enhanced due diligence capabilities. The executive dining room had been redesigned with new crystal glasses, unbreakable ones, as Marcus Thompson had noted with characteristic humor during Ember's recent visit. The service staff now received cultural sensitivity training that emphasized dignity and respect rather than invisible compliance, creating work environments that recognized the intelligence and expertise that service workers often possess despite their apparent social status. The academic implications of Kyle's case continued to reverberate through multiple disciplines. Universities had established new interdisciplinary programs combining linguistics, international business, and criminal justice, creating career paths for students whose interests spanned cultural studies and law enforcement. Ember's methodology had been incorporated into federal training curricula, while her case study was required reading and business ethics courses across the country. The Brennan case demonstrates how academic expertise can provide practical tools for addressing sophisticated criminal activity, she explained to her conference audience. But more importantly, it reveals how assumptions about cultural authenticity can be systematically exploited by criminals who understand the gaps between performance and genuine experience. The consulting firm she had established with Elena specialized in cultural authentication for international business transactions, providing verification services that went far beyond the surface-level credentials that had been standard in the industry before Kyle's exposure. Their client base included not only financial institutions but government agencies, multinational corporations, and academic institutions seeking to verify the cultural claims of international partners and collaborators. The work was intellectually stimulating and financially rewarding, but most importantly, it created systematic barriers to the kind of cultural appropriation fraud that Kyle had perpetrated with such devastating effectiveness.